Did you know that the Gospel of John is filled with language talking about the kingdom? We're going to look at the concepts of the kingdom that has to do with the temple and also the ancient Near East world. We're going to see Yeshua travel from the Galilee back to the temple. So join me in this series, the Gospel of John and the Kingdom. Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah. Welcome to this series, The Kingdom and John's Gospel. Now, the book of John on first reading seems rather cryptic. There's a lot of language in there that feels kind of abstract, doesn't really make a lot of sense to the modern reader. My goal in this series is to take us back to that time, to that ancient world, first century, and examine the book of John from that perspective, looking at the temple language, looking at the language of the ancient Near East world. And so we're going to cover a lot of these different aspects as we go through the book, things that were related to the culture. Now, of course, if you have a kingdom, you need a couple of things. You need the kingdom, you need the king, you need a throne, and you need a place to govern. And so much of the language of the kingdom ends up being language of government, and we don't tend to look at it that way. So we're going to go through this step by step. Before we get too far into it, we got to look at the book of John, who wrote it. We're not exactly sure when it was written. We know that it was Yeshua's beloved disciple, John, or Yochanan in Hebrew. He was part of Yeshua's inner circle. And the book of John, the Gospel of John, really is very different than all the other Gospels. The other Gospels seem to be more eyewitness accounts. And yet the book of John kind of goes into this sort of esoteric, ethereal type language that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, I would suggest that the book of John covers a particular period of Yeshua's life, his ministry. And I have, in my studies, have come to the conclusion that we're dealing with a 3.5-year cycle. And the reason that I say that is that we can follow through the festival cycle, Israel's festival cycle, from basically Rosh Hashanah, or the fall feast, going all the way to Passover in a period of 3.5 years. And so the language of the festivals becomes very important. And of course, Yeshua is constantly going up to the temple to celebrate those festivals. So what we have here is a circuit which takes us, Yeshua would go to Galilee, and then we go back to the temple. And this picture of this circuit, in fact, the name Galilee comes from the root gal, which means a circuit. But this circuit represents Yeshua, if you will, going from heaven to earth, because the temple was a pattern of heaven. In fact, whenever you went up to the temple, it was as if you were going into heaven. And so we see this circuit of him, heaven to earth and back. And so he is connecting these two spheres, if you will. And that'll become very important when we get into chapter 2. But I want to lay the groundwork now for you to understand that that is the picture that we have, Yeshua traveling from Jerusalem, from the temple, and back to the Galilee in this circuit. Of course, the book of John contains the historical account of the crucifixion in much more detail than the other Gospels do. And so the language of the kingdom has to relate to the resurrection, and we'll be talking about that in more detail. And ultimately, the book of John is a much more different style than the others, and it seems to be on a deeper level as well. I know lots of times when people go to church that the pastor would suggest reading the book of John first, but sometimes that's a little difficult. And so hopefully, as I lay out the foundation of the kingdom and the temple and the ancient world, the book will become a little easier to understand. And the key in all this, again, is the festivals. As we go through each chapter, we're going to see Yeshua going up to the temple to celebrate that feast. Now, as I mentioned, Yeshua spent a lot of time in the Galilee. So why don't you join me as we travel to the Galilee and to a very special place by the sea, the synagogue at Capernaum. Shalom, here we are at the synagogue in Capernaum, one of the places that Yeshua spent a great deal of time. Of course, the synagogue, what's left of it from the 4th or 5th century, was a very important place where Yeshua taught. And it was really the administrative center for him. So when he traveled from the Galilee, he often traveled from Capernaum all the way up to the temple. So as I've mentioned, that the language in the book of John, although it seems rather abstract sometimes, is really language of the kingdom. And of course, to have a kingdom, you need a king and you need the throne. And so ultimately, God is our king. His son, Yeshua, would be the one raised up to be king, who would inherit the throne. And in the beginning, the land was seen as the cosmos. And here we are in the land of Israel. So the land of Israel came to represent the cosmos, if you will, the place where God ruled. Ultimately, the temple itself was a palace for the king. That's where the king ruled from. And in the ancient world, what happened was when the god, if you will, would build a house for himself, under the king would actually do the construction. But when the temple was finished, the king would move into the house and he would be the living representative of the god. And so the god of the ancient world would install his agent as the king to rule over his dominion, whatever city that might be. So God has sent his son, Yeshua, to rule and reign over the earth. And he will always rule and reign over the earth, because this is the sphere in which the earth became the picture of the cosmos, or the entirety of the world over which the king would rule. When the king sat on the throne, he basically was the one that established order and stability in that community or in that temple. Ultimately, when Yeshua sits on the throne, he will be bringing order and stability to the entirety of the universe. One of the things that the king did was he would push back the chaos in order to bring order to the world. And this will become very important when we start going through the book of John. Now, one expression here that I really want to present to you, because when we think of the word rest, we have a tendency to think about taking a snooze on a Shabbat afternoon because we're tired. But to the ancient world, this was common in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt as well, but of course we see this for Israel. The idea of rest meant that the king was seated on his throne and he was ruling from that point. So as we go through the Genesis pattern, we see in the first chapter of Genesis at the end, when God rested, is a statement that his house was finished and that he had moved in, that he had brought order to the universe, and he had established his stability in that sphere. It also meant that the king's enemies had been defeated. So this will all become very important as we talk about Yeshua going through his coronation ritual and becoming king and sitting on the throne and pushing back the enemies. Now, the enemies at that particular time in the first century is going to be Rome, and in particular, the Caesars. And we'll get into this in more detail, but the language of Son of God, although we understand that Yeshua is a Son of God, was a very common expression in the ancient world. And so Caesar himself had the title of Son of God because all kings in the ancient world were called sons of God. So the father, the king that went before him when he would raise up a son or another king, the title given to that king was Son of God. So there's this battle going on in the first century between Yeshua, the Son of God, and between Caesar, the Son of God. So that will become important. And of course, Yeshua, seated on the throne, has defeated the enemies, and in that particular time has defeated Rome. So this is significant. So this concept of rest, when peace and stability come to the kingdom, we would describe it as the Sabbath. Sometimes we describe it in terms of the millennial kingdom, because rest has come and enemies have been defeated. So this is a very important concept, and I'm trying to establish that so that we can understand exactly what's taking place in the book of John, this concept of rest and kingdom. They're basically interchangeable terms. Now, just a picture, because everything goes back to the garden. The garden is the key to everything. The garden was sacred space. The garden was that space that God created for man to live and to work. And when God is talking about man living and working in that space, he's looking at man as a priest serving in sacred space. So the garden is sacred space, the same way the cosmos is sacred space, the same way the temple was sacred space. And in the ancient world, we find that most of the temples had what we call a tripartite structure. And what that means is they have 3 levels or 3 sections. So we see this in the temple in Jerusalem, Second Temple, for example. You have your outer court. When you enter into the temple building, you were in the holy place. And when you went past that through the curtains into the Holy of Holies, there were 3 basically levels or 3 levels of sanctity in which the priest would go up to that sacred space. The ultimate sacred space, divided into 3 parts, would be God as he created heaven, earth, and sea. So the cosmos was seen as a temple, and so those three areas were part of his sacred space. Now we take it down to the garden. The garden also had 3 levels or 3 areas of sacred space. We know that God rested, actually, that's the expression, Adam in the garden. And again, that term rested has to do with defeating enemies and raising up someone to be king. So Adam was not only the priest in the garden, but he also served as king. That's where he ruled and reigned from. So the whole area was called Eden. So we have Eden is the inner chamber, like we would see the Holy of Holies. The garden represented the holy place where the priest served, and the outer court. Of course, I suggest that the outer court has something to do with what we call the world or the field. And so the waters started in Eden and passed through the garden and basically emptied out into the field to water the plains. So I would just like to follow this up with a quote from Yitzhak Ginsburg. And he said that at the level of divinity, the house symbolizes the purpose of all reality, to become a dwelling place below for the manifestation of God's presence. And this is key. What is the point and purpose of building a temple? It is to build a house for God. And that's what the gods did in the ancient world. They had their kings build houses for them. So the manifestation of God's presence is key. And that will become significant because it talks about God dwelling in the midst of us. And even in the first chapter of John, we see that Yeshua took on flesh and tabernacled or dwelt among us. And that was the very purpose of the temple. And ultimately, as we go through the book of John, we'll see that Yeshua manifests as the temple himself. And so what happens in the ancient world when temples are destroyed, it meant that in a very broad sense, the creation itself had collapsed. If there was no temple, there was no place for God to dwell. So this is very significant as we go through the book of John, and we're seeing that Yeshua is that temple, that word that became flesh to temple or tabernacle in the midst of his people. Because without a temple, it meant there was no God to rule and reign over them. The temple was the connecting point between heaven and earth. And this is key. I talked about earlier how we have this circuit that goes on through the book of John, where we see that Yeshua, he does go to other places, for instance, the Mount of Olives, but typically Yeshua is traveling from the Galilee up to the temple. So he's traveling from earth, if you will, back up to heaven, because the temple represented heaven. And so that was the place when you entered into the temple where you would meet your God. That was where the God resided if you were in ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt, etc. So when you went to the temple, you entered into heaven. That's how they looked at it when they had the tabernacle in the wilderness, the temple that Solomon built, and of course the second temple that was expanded by Herod. The children of Israel understood that they were going up into heaven to meet their God, because after all, their God did not dwell in the earthly realm. Our God, their God, dwelled in the world outside of time, which was represented by the Holy of Holies. So when they went up to the temple, it was as though they were entering into the world outside of time, where they would meet their God. Now, there was a specific pattern and a protocol in which you went up to the temple to meet with your God. You couldn't just enter. Obviously, certain people were able to go to certain places. There were levels of sanctity you could not violate. The idea was you were always going up. We have a term when you emigrate to Israel, it's called making aliyah, to go up, because everywhere else in the world was seen as a lower level of sanctity. But when you went up to Israel, you were entering, and as you went up to the temple, you were entering into the presence of God. That is the place where the presence of God existed. And so that was where you had access to your God and access to what we would call the world beyond time. As we go through the book of John, we're going to find that Yeshua is spoken of a lot as the Messiah. In Hebrew, Mashiach, which means anointed one, which means he was anointed to be king. And he was the son of the God, or the son of God. He was royalty. He was given a dominion to rule and reign over. And all of this language is contained in the book of John. We just don't recognize it with our modern mind. We're not used to having monarchs rule over us. We are not, temples are not something that we're comfortable with or that we know about or that we have experienced. And so if we understand that language and that culture, it's going to help us and see Yeshua as king. Oftentimes we just throw that out. We say, yeah, he's our king. He's the son of God. We have no understanding of what that truly means, to really grasp hold of the fact that Yeshua is the king seated on the throne. He may be in the world outside of time, but he is returning, and he will take with him heaven and earth will meet together. We'll be talking about that again because, folks, our home is on the earth. When Yeshua is ruling and reigning and sitting on his throne from the earth, this is our home. And the pattern is to return back to the garden. The earth was meant to be a garden as our home. Now, ultimately, God, when he put Adam into the garden, Adam became his image bearer, his priest, his king to serve. And so Yeshua came along and he would be the second Adam. And so the second Adam was God's image bearer who would rule and reign from this place. And so it's very important to see how Yeshua, when he went into the temple, the things that he would say at festival time, how different it would have been than all the other gods. And he was making a distinction between himself and the gods of this world. And he was given the authority to go into the temple because at that time the temple was a very corrupt place. The high priests that were ruling at that time were not from the line of Aaron. There was a lot of bribery and graft, extortion, things like that going on in that temple environment. So God was unable to dwell in that place. And so not only was Yeshua called to literally go up to cleanse the temple in order for God's presence to be restored, but he himself took that presence in himself and went out into the people as the living temple. It's an interesting pattern. So all of this, again, is contained in the book of John. Again, I'm laying the foundation so that you can see the language of the temple and of the ancient Near East world is critical to understand the book. Now, I'm not saying that you can't just read the book of John and let the words wash over you and bring healing and restoration. But there's something much more important happening underneath. We have got to grab hold of the concept of the kingdom. The kingdom is key to everything. The kingdom is in this world. It is moving, albeit moving slowly, but the kingdom presence is moving to the four corners of the earth. And sometimes we simply don't recognize it, and that we don't appreciate that our king is seated on the throne, ruling and reigning. Now, again, in the ancient world, temples were the palace. That was a palace for the king. That's where the king sat, ruled, and reigned from. In particular, the Holy of Holies. That was said to be the inner chamber, the inner sanctum, where the throne was. So the Ark of the Covenant came to represent the throne of God. That was the royal throne located inside that sacred space. And of course, only the high priest could enter that sacred space once a year. And so he was entering into that place where the presence of God was supposed to dwell and to bring, in a sense, that presence out to the people. Again, I remind you that whenever you went up to the temple in the ancient world, it was as though you were entering heaven. And so when we see language of angels, they are basically heavenly priests serving in that place. And the only place where you could enter into heaven from earth was in a temple. And of course, ultimately, the temple of our King in the land of Israel is the Temple of Temples, where the Holy of Holies was. Again, the ancient world of the Second Temple period is filled with temples. We go to Ephesus and see the Temple of Diana. Every city had a temple, and every temple had their god or goddess, and every city had their king worshiping their god or goddess. This is very common in that world, and so it's something we're unfamiliar with, but it is important. The other thing about temples too is that they served as the sacred center. So again, a temple was situated between heaven and earth, and so it functioned as the center, the sacred center, where the rituals, etc., went on in order to come into the presence of the king. Sacred centers came in other different forms. For example, mountains were seen as temples, and they represented sacred centers because they were the horizontal, if you will, between earth and heaven. And so we see language in John when Yeshua is going to a place and up on a high mountain. That is a metaphor for temple language, where Yeshua is entering into that holy space. Sometimes, of course, we saw, for example, in the Transfiguration with Peter and John, and he was up on a high mountain. It doesn't tell us what mountain it was, because that's not the point. Mountains represented temples, and so it was as though they were all in the presence of God. And remember, the first thing they wanted to do was build Sukkot, or basically mini temples. And as we look around here at Capernaum, the synagogues basically were mini temples. The things that went on in the synagogue mirrored what went on in the temple. Obviously, not everybody could go up to Jerusalem for the festivals, and so they had their local synagogue to be able to do the things that were patterning or mirroring what was going on basically up in Jerusalem for those who lived out in the outer parts of the empire. So this sacred center, again, mountains. We see other things in Scripture, stalks. You may remember the story of Joseph. And he saw in one of his dreams, his stalk was standing up, and his brothers, who represented the other grain stalks, were all bowing down before him. So this is also language, king language, and restoration between heaven and earth. The stalk represented that connecting point. We see that in trees. Trees in the ancient world were connecting points between heaven and earth. So all of these things, pillars, you know that in the front of the Temple of Solomon, we have those two large pillars. They represented, once again, that connection between heaven and earth. The altars in the temple served in much the same way. Vines, we see descriptions of vines in Scripture. Yeshua talks about being the vine. It is the connecting point between heaven and earth. And ultimately, we have columns as well. We see that in temples. You see that in all types of architecture in the ancient world. So covered a lot of ground, and I'm going to just sort of try to tie this up before we actually move into John chapter 1. That mountains are very significant, that this idea of ascending a mountain was ascending into the presence of God. It was synonymous with ascending the throne. And so we're going to see that type of language once again with Yeshua. There's different stories of him being on the mountain, but the idea of ascending into the presence of God and ascending to the throne. So we're just going to tie that up right now and right here, and hopefully that this has really helped you to understand the backdrop as we go into the book of John. It's very significant and very important material, and I'm going to be drawing on this as I go through the book itself. We're going to go through virtually every chapter, not every verse, but talking about how the kingdom is made manifest through that book. So I hope you've been able to see that the temple, which served as the palace for the king, the Holy of Holies being his throne, was the focus of the entirety of Jewish life. And again, the synagogues mirrored that temple. So when you went to the synagogue, it was as though you were doing exactly the same thing that you were doing in the temple. So everything was dependent upon the temple. It was ground zero for Jewish life. Everything revolved around that. We'll talk about that in a little more detail next time. But this is the key. I can't stress it enough. If we're going to understand the kingdom, we've got to understand that the temple served as the pattern for the kingdom. What went on there is supposed to go on in the kingdom. How priests serve there is how we are supposed to serve as priests. We talked about the garden, and in the garden where Adam worked and served the garden, he guarded the garden. That was priestly type service. And so that same service is incumbent upon us. I particularly like this quote from Margaret Barker, which I think kind of sums up a bit of our dilemma in understanding all that. And she says that it is clear that the early Christians themselves adopted a figurative way of reading the Old Testament, and they attached great importance to the ritual and symbolism of the temple, which ultimately represented creation. And we're going to be talking about that in more detail because the pattern of the temple was the pattern of creation. Everything mattered. When the temple was destroyed, creation itself was being destroyed. The temple as creation was the center of the universe. And so we find that the temple itself looks like a mini universe. And this is the place where Yeshua spent most of his time. Again, traveling from the temple back to Jerusalem, back to the Galilee in his circuit, as he was bringing forth the kingdom, as people could see in him how the kingdom was made manifest. The secret of the kingdom is that God the Father is in our midst, dwelling in our midst. And so Yeshua, as he moved out into the byways and the highways and into the marketplace, was basically replicating that the presence of God was literally in Yeshua as he walked out. So he was literally bringing the kingdom forth to the whole world. This is, again, the kingdom language that's in John. And so we are supposed to serve in the same way. We are supposed to model that king and priest type behavior. That is how we are supposed to bring the kingdom out into the world. And we'll be talking about this in greater detail as we go through this series and talking about the kingdom in John's gospel. Thanks for joining me. Shalom.